It started with a text message. Simple, short, and completely unsettling. At first, I thought it was just a prank, or maybe a wrong number. The message appeared late at night, just as I was getting ready for bed. The kind of time when you're already feeling that quiet unease that often accompanies the transition from day to night. I like the way you sleep. I stared at the screen, confused. Who was this? The number was unfamiliar, just a random string of digits. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something about the message made my skin crawl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the words themselves, but the timing. It was as if the sender knew exactly when I was winding down for the night. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a joke or a mistake. Wrong number, I texted back, trying to shake off the strange feeling it left. I didn't hear back for a while, and eventually I forgot about it, slipping into a restless sleep. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the message was more specific. I like the way you sleep when you're on your side. I sat up straight in bed, staring at the screen. My heart raced. I always slept on my side, but how did they know that? Maybe someone was just watching me from a distance, maybe even through a window. Maybe it was someone who lived in the building next to mine. Someone who had seen me through the blinds. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was harmless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I didn't respond this time. I just put my phone down and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the apartment, every faint whisper of the wind outside, felt like someone was lurking, waiting. The next few nights, the messages kept coming. You're always so still when you sleep. You don't move a muscle until the alarm goes off. Your pillow is positioned just right for your head. They became more specific with every message, as if the sender had been watching me for weeks, learning my habits, my routines. I could feel my anxiety building with each new text. Every time I thought I was safe, another message would arrive, keeping me on edge, unsure whether I was truly alone. It wasn't just the details that unsettled me. It was the fact that they seemed to know more than anyone could reasonably know about me. They knew my habits. They knew how I slept. They knew the exact times I went to bed. The worst part, the texts always came when I was lying in bed, just before I drifted off to sleep, as if they were waiting for that precise moment to strike. One night, I decided to confront it. I took a deep breath and sent a message back. Who is this? The response came almost immediately. You don't need to know my name. Just know that I've been watching you. I've been in your apartment before. I know exactly where you keep your things. The blood drained from my face. I felt the air in my room grow cold. My pulse quickened. I had checked the locks on my doors and windows. Everything was secure. But if someone had been in my apartment, how could they know these things? How could they know where I kept my spare keys? My medicine? The old books on the shelf? I had never told anyone those details. I started to panic. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Had someone broken into my place? Had they been hiding in the shadows, watching me while I slept? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I stayed awake, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the next message. I didn't want to sleep, but eventually, my exhaustion caught up with me. As I drifted off, I thought I heard something faint, a rustling sound, like someone moving around in the darkness of my apartment. I jolted awake, heart pounding. I reached for my phone. There was a new message. You should have locked the bathroom door. I froze. My bathroom door. I always locked it at night. But tonight, in my exhaustion, I had forgotten. Slowly, cautiously, I turned toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach twisted into a knot. The whispering sound I had heard earlier now seemed clearer. Closer. I slowly stood up, heart thudding in my chest. I was terrified, but I had to check. As I approached the bathroom, I noticed something on the floor just outside the door. A dark smudge, like something had been dragged across the floor. I opened the door. The bathroom was empty, but on the mirror, written in fog, were the words, I see you. I screamed, backing away from the door. The air in the apartment felt thick, suffocating. I was sure someone was in here with me, but when I checked every corner of my apartment, I found nothing. Just a faint, lingering sense of someone watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind, including my phone, but even as I drove away from that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that the messages hadn't stopped, that somehow, someone or something was still watching me. I thought leaving the apartment would bring peace. I moved into a new place, changed my number, deleted everything. But every night as I lay in bed, I would hear it. The faint buzz of my phone. I would look at it, and there, without fail, was a message from the same unknown number. The words would be simple, but chilling. I know you're awake. It didn't matter where I went, or how much time had passed. The voice, the presence, it always found me. I was never free. The evil that haunted me had never left. It would always return. Waiting. It was one of those cold, rainy nights in the suburbs when the darkness seemed to press in a little too closely, wrapping itself around the houses like an unseen hand. I had just finished dinner, and my husband, Greg, was watching the game on TV. Our kids, Lily and Ben, had already gone to bed, tucked under their warm blankets. I sat in the living room, sipping on tea, staring out the window as the storm outside raged on. The trees in our yard swayed violently in the wind, their branches scratching against the windows. The rain came down in sheets, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. I wasn't scared. I'd lived in this house for years. It was the kind of house you grow attached to, full of familiar sounds and creaks that made it feel like home. But then, just as I was about to close the curtains and settle in for the night, I saw it. A face. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. The window, misted by the rain, was mostly blurry, but there, at the edge, was a pale face, staring at me. I could see the outline of it. The outline of eyes wide open, mouth slightly agape, and the faintest hint of dark hair. The face seemed so close, like it was pressed right up against the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I gasped. I stood up abruptly, knocking my tea over, but my eyes couldn't leave the window. The face didn't move. It just stared, unmoving, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. I took a step toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass, and as I did, the face vanished. I stood there frozen for a few moments, staring at the spot where the face had been. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been my reflection? No, I was sure it wasn't. The face had been too distinct, too real. But how? How could anyone be that close to the window without me hearing them? I had checked the yard just earlier in the day when I came back from the grocery store, and there was no one around. "Greg?" I called out softly, my voice trembling. He didn't hear me, engrossed in the game. I quickly grabbed my phone, texting him. But as my fingers hovered over the keys, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping at the window. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned to look outside, there was nothing. The rain continued to fall, the trees swaying in the wind, but the face was gone. My breathing slowed as I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. The tapping had sounded so deliberate. Maybe I'm just tired, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. But when I checked the window, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, on the glass, were wet handprints. I gasped, stepping back. They were unmistakable. Small, damp handprints, smeared on the inside of the window. No one had been near the window. Greg was inside watching the game. The kids were asleep upstairs, tucked in their rooms. I had checked the doors and windows earlier in the evening. No one could have gotten close enough to leave their mark. I grabbed my phone again, texting Greg. "There's something weird happening." There were handprints on the window, like someone had been outside. His response came quickly. What do you mean, handprints? You're probably seeing things. It's just the rain messing with your eyes. I didn't feel reassured by his reply. The handprints were so clear, so fresh. They couldn't have been there for long. I ran my fingers over the glass, feeling the cool moisture beneath them. My stomach twisted in knots as I examined the marks, trying to figure out how they had appeared. I turned around and, to my shock, found the window completely open. How had it opened? I never left it open. The latch was still locked. The curtains were undisturbed. I had closed the window earlier, hadn't I? In a panic, I checked the rest of the house. I checked all the doors, all the windows. Everything was secure, just as it had been when I first came in. The wind outside howled as the storm raged, but I couldn't ignore the growing feeling of unease in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. I stood there for a few moments, staring at the handprints, my mind racing, my thoughts spiraling. I needed to tell Greg. I needed someone to explain this, to reassure me that it was just a figment of my imagination. But as I turned to call out to him, I saw something else, something that made my heart stop. The faintest shape. A shadow moved just beyond the window. A figure. I could barely make it out through the rain, but it was there. I felt paralyzed. The figure didn't move. It stood still for what felt like an eternity. And then, the wind shifted, and it vanished, melting into the night. I finally screamed, rushing toward the living room, shaking Greg awake. He groggily stood up, confused by my frantic state. "Get up, please. Look outside. Someone is here." I could barely get the words out, my throat tight with fear. But when he rushed to the window and looked out, he saw nothing. The yard was empty, save for the rain and the dark trees. "There's nothing here, honey," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge of confusion in it. "No, I swear." There was a face. It was watching me, right outside the window. I stammered, trying to explain, but he only shook his head. "I think you've had a long day. Let's get some sleep. You're imagining things." I wanted to argue, to tell him what I had seen, but I couldn't. Something deep inside me told me that whatever was happening wasn't something I could explain. It felt too real. The handprints, the face, it was too much. I was convinced that something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up groggily, hoping the whole thing had been a nightmare. I stood up, stretching, and walked toward the window, only to stop short. The handprints were gone, but as I stared at the glass, I saw something else. At the very top of the window, a streak of something wet. It looked like a finger had been dragged across it, and beneath it, the words were written. "I'm watching you." I felt the blood drain from my face as I stumbled back. How had those words gotten there? They hadn't been there the night before. Who was doing this? What were they trying to tell me? Greg came in behind me and noticed my reaction. "What's wrong?" "Look," I pointed toward the glass. But when he looked, the words were gone. The window was clean, untouched. The streaks, the writing, all disappeared. I was shaking now, my mind spinning. Had I imagined it? But no, I saw it. I saw the words. I wasn't crazy. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Scratching at the windows, tapping at the walls. I would jump awake, my heart racing. But when I looked around, the house was silent. Everything was still. I tried to ignore it, to sleep through the night. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. A voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering through the dark. "I'm still here." I backed away from the window, my breath shaky. The whispering didn't stop. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside me. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse hammering. The whispering hadn't stopped. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. A realization crept in, slow and suffocating. The handprints on the glass, the size, the shape, weren't from an intruder. They were small, childlike, A sound echoed behind me, a faint creak of a door swinging open. I turned slowly toward the hallway. Lily and Ben's bedroom door stood ajar. My heart clenched. I had tucked them in. I had kissed their foreheads. But suddenly, I wasn't so sure. Greg's voice cut through the silence, groggy. "Honey, what are you doing?" I swallowed hard. My hands were trembling. I tried to answer, but my throat was dry. A memory surfaced. Flashes of a different stormy night. A scream. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I stared at my own hands. My fingers were damp, smudged, like they'd been pressing against something cold and wet. I turned back to the window, and there, reflected in the glass, was Lily. Not in her bed, not asleep. Standing just behind me, her mouth barely moved as she whispered, "Mummy, why did you lock the door?" It started on a cold autumn evening, the kind where the wind cuts through fabric and the streetlights flicker as if struggling to stay alive. Nathan had just stepped off the bus. His apartment only a 10-minute walk away. He adjusted his coat, shivering as he made his way down the dimly lit sidewalk. The streets were empty, just the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. The silence was comforting at first, a quietness that allowed him to clear his head after a long day. But then, just as he turned the first corner, he heard them. Footsteps, light, deliberate. Following his own pace, Nathan stopped abruptly. Following his own pace, the sound ceased. He glanced over his shoulder. The street was empty. A single streetlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. He let out a breath and continued walking. Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps returned. His pulse quickened. He turned around again, expecting to see someone. Anyone. But there was no one. Just the same quiet street, the same cold wind. He walked faster. The steps behind him did the same. He broke into a run, his breath coming in sharp bursts. His apartment was just a few blocks away. He didn't dare look back. When he reached his front door, he fumbled for his keys, hands trembling. The footsteps were right behind him now, impossibly close. He could feel it. Something standing just at his back. He slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. His chest heaved as he pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. For a moment, he laughed to himself. It had to be paranoia, exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. He took a deep breath and headed toward the kitchen for a glass of water. And then, tap, tap, tap. The footsteps were inside. His blood turned to ice. He spun around. The apartment was empty. The door was still locked. The windows closed, but the sound was unmistakable. Soft, steady steps moving across the wooden floor. Nathan grabbed the nearest object, a knife from the kitchen counter. "Who's there?" he called, his voice barely steady. No answer. A shadow shifted near the hallway. His throat tightened. He could see it now, just at the edge of his vision. A shape, darker than the shadows themselves, standing inside his apartment. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped backward. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Then, the lights flickered, and it ran toward him. Nathan barely had time to scream. It began on an ordinary autumn evening, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, under the dim glow of streetlights and the steady drumming of rain. Alexander Cole returned home from work. The chill in the air matched the weight in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite shake off. His modest house, a 2-story brick dwelling tucked away on a peaceful street, had been his sanctuary for the past 2 years. Yet that night, something felt off. Alexander unlocked the door and stepped into his living room. The space was neat and comforting. Soft beige walls, a plush sofa, and family photos that whispered of happier days. He had no idea that his life was about to change. Later that night, As midnight neared and the storm raged outside, he sat alone on his sofa in the living room. The silence was broken only by the rain's persistent tapping against the windows. He sighed, turned off the TV, and sank into a restless doze. At precisely 12:03 a.m., his computer chimed with a new email notification. Alexander frowned as he clicked on the message. The subject was blank, and the sender's address was an unrecognizable jumble of letters and numbers. Curious, he opened the attachment. A single image file. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. A selfie of himself taken in his living room, exactly as he was sitting on the sofa. The timestamp read 12:03 a.m., but he didn't remember taking any such photo. Even more disturbing was the background, where behind the sofa, barely visible in the dim light, a ghostly figure loomed. The face was pale, its features indistinct yet horrifyingly present. Alexander's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He replayed the image, zooming in on the background. There it was again, a figure standing behind the sofa, half hidden by the shadows. The realization made him shudder. Had someone been in his house? Was this some kind of cruel prank? He checked every room, retraced his steps for the evening. The front door was securely locked, the windows closed. His security camera system, installed only a month ago, showed no signs of intrusion. The image was the only evidence he had. With a heavy heart, he tried to convince himself it was a glitch, perhaps a hacked camera, or an error in his email system. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving the streets washed clean. Yet Alexander could not shake the terror that clung to him. As he sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, his eyes drifted to the living room window. To his horror, he saw faint, damp smudges on the glass handprints. They were small, almost childlike, and they glistened in the early morning light. No one had come near his window. The thought sent chills down his spine. He called his neighbor, a kind man named Robert, but Robert insisted that nothing unusual had occurred. "Maybe you're just tired, Alex," Robert said kindly over the phone. But Alexander wasn't convinced. That night, as rain began to fall again, Alexander stayed up, determined to catch any sign of the mysterious figure. He sat before his computer, eyes glued to the security feed. Though he had not seen anything the previous night, the clock ticked slowly toward midnight. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the rain. Just after 12:08, a soft noise caught his attention. A faint clicking sound near the living room window. Alexander's heart pounded as he looked at the live feed. There, in the background of his living room, was a figure. This time, the face was more visible. A gaunt, pale visage with dark, empty eyes. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Alexander sat frozen, his mind racing. Could it be a ghost? Or had his mind finally succumbed to paranoia? He checked his phone and found another email. This one contained a new image. In it, he was captured from a different angle, still on his sofa. But now, the figure was unmistakable. It stood directly behind the sofa, its hand partly raised, as if reaching out. The timestamp read 12:05 a.m. The next few nights followed a similar pattern. Every midnight, an email arrived. Each photo was a variation of the last. Different angles, sometimes with the figure closer, sometimes obscured by shadows. Always the eerie, unknown presence lurked behind him. Each morning, Alexander discovered new evidence. Fresh, wet handprints on his window. Sometimes a dark streak that looked like a dragged finger, and sometimes nothing at all. The emails continued with no explanation, just the unnerving images and a recurring timestamp that matched the moment he supposedly slept. Desperation and dread began to consume him. He confided in his wife, Melissa, who tried to comfort him. "Maybe it's just a glitch with your email or camera," she said, but her eyes betrayed worry. They scoured the internet for answers, reading countless ghost stories and creepypasta tales. Nothing could truly explain what he was experiencing. The only certainty was that someone, or something, was watching him at the darkest hours of the night. One fateful evening, with the storm raging outside and the clock nearing midnight, Alexander decided he had to confront the truth. He armed himself with a flashlight and a trembling resolve, determined to capture evidence of the phenomenon in person. He set up additional cameras around the living room and sat in a recliner facing the window. As the minutes ticked by in an agonizing silence, he felt as though the darkness outside was closing in on him. At exactly 12:00 a.m., the window's reflection shifted. There, standing in the rain, was the figure, its face pale and expressionless, its eyes seeming to bore into him. Alexander's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for his phone to record the moment live. The figure moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if drawn by some unseen force. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the air. "I'm always watching." The sound made his blood run cold. In that split second, the image on his phone froze. Alexander felt a searing pain in his chest, and his vision blurred. The screen showed the figure reaching out. Then, everything went black. Alexander's confrontation with the ghost left him traumatized. In the weeks that followed, the emails continued even while he was in therapy. One day, while debugging his computer, he discovered that all the emails were sent from his own IP address. Panic set in as he realized someone had hacked into his system. But the horror deepened when he found that his sent folder contained images he never captured. The ghost was not just a paranormal entity. It was a digital nightmare, an echo of his own suppressed guilt. And as the images multiplied, Alexander understood. He was the one who had unleashed this terror upon himself. The party at Ethan's lake house had been winding down for hours. Most guests had already left, leaving only the six of us: Ethan, Maddie, Ryan, Sarah, Jake, and me. It was supposed to be one last get-together before we all went our separate ways. College, jobs, real life. It was all coming fast. One more night of drinking, laughing, and pretending everything was okay. Then, the power cut out. A split second later, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. The room was plunged into thick, suffocating darkness. At first, we thought it was a prank, someone messing around. But when Ethan tried the door, it wouldn't budge. He rattled it. Deadlocked. A phone buzzed. Ryan fumbled for his in the dark. "Wow." He went silent. Then, in a low, shaking voice, he read aloud, "Welcome to the game. One of you is hiding something. A real crime you will confess, one by one, or no one leaves." The power flickered back on, but only the single overhead bulb, casting long, eerie shadows against the wooden walls. No windows, just us and the door we couldn't open. "All right," Jake muttered. "Who's the sick bastard doing this?" Another buzz. Maddie looked at her phone, her face going pale. She turned the screen toward us. A picture of Maddie, taken tonight, but from the perspective of someone inside the room. She scrambled to her feet, knocking over a beer bottle. "This isn't funny anymore." "Who took that?" Sarah whispered. Before anyone could answer, Ryan's phone buzzed again. He checked the message, then his face drained of color. "Read it," Ethan said. Ryan swallowed hard and spoke. "Maddie, tell them what happened to Emily." A sharp, breathless silence fell over the room. Maddie froze. "Well, what?" Ryan turned the screen toward her. It was a photo of Emily. Her face, pale, vacant, the missing girl. Maddie stumbled backward. I don't know what this is." "Liar." The voice came from the speakers in the room. A deep, distorted voice that wasn't ours. And then the closet door creaked open. We all whirled toward the closet. It had been closed before. I was sure of it. Now it stood open just a crack. Maddie was shaking. "This is some sick joke." Jake stepped forward and yanked the door open. Inside, a school sweater, dirty, torn, and embroidered on the front, Emily's nan. Maddie let out a strangled sob. Sarah took a step away from her. "Maddie, what did you do?" Maddie clutched at her arms, her eyes darting to the door, the windowless walls, looking for any escape. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "Emily and I got into a fight that night. She threatened to tell people about me and Mr. Hayes." Silence. Sarah covered her mouth. Ryan stiffened. "Our teacher? What the hell, Maddie? I didn't push her." Maddie's voice cracked. She tripped. She hit her head. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I left her there. A soft ding echoed through the room. Maddie's phone screen lit up. "Good girl. Who's next?" No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with fear and disgust. Maddie slid to the floor, sobbing. Jake's phone buzzed next. He hesitated before looking at it. His face darkened. He turned it toward us. A photo of a bloody tire iron. Then the message. "Jake, tell them about the accident." A cold dread settled in my stomach. Jake's hands curled into fists. "This is bullshit." Sarah's voice was small. "Jake, what accident?" Ryan stepped forward. "Jake? Answer her." Jake's nostrils flared. "It was a mistake, all right. We were drunk. We didn't see him. And he was just some homeless guy." His voice was shaking now. He wasn't moving. We thought he was already dead. We panicked. A sickening silence spread through the room. Sarah's lip trembled. Who was driving? Jake's gaze flickered to Ethan. My stomach dropped. Ethan's face went cold. "You son of a bitch," Ethan growled. Jake turned toward him. "You were just as guilty. You were behind the wheel. You told me to drive." The lights flickered. The distorted voice returned. "Tell them where you buried him." Jake gasped. No. Then the closet door slammed shut. The room was spinning. We weren't just locked in here with a stalker. We were locked in with our own sins. Ryan's phone buzzed one more time. His hand shook as he lifted it. The message simply read, "Who's the liar?" A cold realization crept over me. "Wait," I whispered. "Someone here set this up." Maddie looked up, red-eyed. "What?" "Think about it." My voice shook. They knew everything. About Emily. About the accident. This isn't some stranger. I looked around the room. This is someone who already knew. A long, slow creak came from the ceiling, like someone walking above us. Then, boom. A deafening crash as something slammed against a locked door. The light flickered out, and then footsteps. Coming closer. The glow of a single phone screen illuminated a face. And then a soft, chilling whisper. "I warned you." The door burst open. I don't remember much after that. Screaming, running, the icy air when we finally got outside. But when I turned back to look at the lake house, the upstairs light was still on. And standing in the window, a silhouette, watching. No one spoke as we got into the car. No one looked at each other. But when we reached the highway, my phone buzzed. A final message. I turned it toward the others, my hands ice cold. "See you soon. One of you is still lying." I looked up, and I swear to God, Maddie was smiling. One